This is the Sony A7 IV, and I've had it for about 7 months, I think, and it is one of the best hybrid cameras on the market right now. Let's talk about it. Roll the intro. I don't have any, so I'm just gonna really quickly go over the specs of this camera. I imagine you already know most of these, but we'll go over it anyway. It is a full frame 33 megapixel sensor. Let's see if we can get that in the light. No, not really, there we go. It is advertised as a hybrid camera, so it is sort of in the middle of, you know, it has more megapixels than a video camera would, but less megapixels than a photo camera would. And it is built like a photo camera, like most mirrorless cameras are these days, although there's some of the newer cameras that are built more for video, like the FX30 that I'm filming on now, that has more video-centric features. This obviously, it has those video features, but not as many, and it's just not built for video. So it has all the like physical features that you'd expect, a flip out screen. It has a bunch of customizable buttons and dials. It has 3 dials actually. One of them is lockable, which is nice. It has full-size HDMI, mic, headphone, USB-C, and their multi-function USB, which is micro USB. So it has all that connectivity, which is good, and it can do that USB streaming over the USB-C. It has viewfinder that is apparently pretty good. I don't really use the viewfinder ever, and the LCD screen isn't the best, but it's fine. It has dual card slots, but only one of them is both CF Express Type A and SD card. So I currently have a CF Express Type A card in there now. So you can have either a CF Express Type A card and an SD card, or 2 SD cards. You can't have 2 CF Express Type A cards. And of course it takes the Sony A7IV batteries, just like all of their modern alpha cameras. And of course it's Sony E-mount. I feel like I shouldn't need to say that. But that's the A7 IV, and now I'm going to talk about the biggest things that I've sort of noticed, and the good and the bad things that sort of stand out with this camera. And I'm not really going to talk about the things that don't really stand out. So one of the things that I was excited about for this camera, but was a surprise that I wasn't able to use it, and that is 10-bit 422. Now, this camera, along with the FX30, the A7S III, the FX3, all those cameras, they can shoot video in 10-bit 422, but not all editing programs can support that. And I currently edit on the free version of DaVinci Resolve, which doesn't support 10-bit, and that was a surprise to me when I tried to edit the first clips that I shot with this camera when I first got it, and I couldn't do it. I did talk about this in my first impressions video of this when I did the unboxing. That was just sort of disappointing to find out that I couldn't use one of the really good features of these cameras. So I still shoot everything in 8-bit. That's also one of the reasons why I don't shoot S-Log3, because apparently S-Log3 in 8-bit is not great, but in 10-bit it's good. I shoot everything in S-Cinetone, and once I get the studio version of DaVinci Resolve, I will start shooting in 10-bit 422 and in S-Log3. All right, now the big one that a lot of people were talking about when this camera first came out, the APS-C crop. This camera has a mode in it you can switch to APS-C mode, which basically crops into an APS-C size sensor from the full frame. So it's basically a 1.5 times crop. This is great, especially if you're using prime lenses and you just want to quickly zoom in a bit and still maintain 4K quality in your videos. Or if you want to get more reach out of your zoom lens, like this could become a 300mm lens if I crop into the APS-C mode. And I think this is a great feature to have in sensors that allow that. So basically if you have an oversampled sensor, and then if you crop into APS-C mode, you're still over 4K. All cameras should have that mode. The downside to the APS-C mode is that it forces you into the crop when you're shooting 4K 50 or 4K 60, which is not ideal, but it sort of makes sense. Like, this isn't a particularly high-end camera. It is cheaper than like the A7S series and the A7R series. I understand that, you know, you're not necessarily going to be able to do 4K 60 full frame, but it does kind of suck, especially if you're changing between, you know, 25p and 50p, that there is going to be a difference in focal length. So if you're, you know, using a 7200 telephoto lens, basically it becomes a 105 to 300, so you can't really get close to things and zoom out. You're stuck at that 105, or if you're using a prime lens, you're stuck at whatever the cropped in version of that would be. And that's a big thing that a lot of people were talking about when it came out. and I get it. It is probably my least favorite thing about this camera. So that's when something like a FX3 would come in, or an FX6. All right, now let's talk about the autofocus in this camera. I haven't really had many issues with autofocus. The only times I have had issues with autofocus with this camera really is with the cheaper lens that I do have, which is the 85mm 1.8. This one. This is a much older lens and cheaper lens, so it just doesn't have the same autofocus performance as the 20mm G or the 7200G Master Mark II. That being said, like, this sometimes can be a little slow, but only when you're doing like whip pans at 200mm. It's not a big deal. But other than that, the autofocus has been relatively flawless. A couple times, maybe it'll just sort of miss, but you know, when you want it to, it's pretty good, reasonably fast, and you can have good control over it as well. You can adjust the speed and the transition speed and all that sort of stuff. I like using autofocus for stuff like this because then I can autofocus to my eye and I can move around and it doesn't matter because it'll just stay locked onto my face. Whereas manual focusing this and then I need to just not move, and I don't want to do that. So autofocus is pretty good. Now when it comes to the ergonomics, one thing that I don't like about the ergonomics of this camera is just holding it like this. It's not particularly comfortable. The bottom corner sort of digs into your hand. The grip is just a bit short, like my pinky just sort of falls off. But luckily, I actually like never use the camera like this. I've been using this cage since not that long after I got the camera, and this makes it a whole lot better. One, I have the hand strap on there because it's just so much better. I actually made a short about this, so you can go see that. But it also adds a little bit more length and sort of roundness to the grip, so it's way more comfortable to hold. And it also makes it just a little bit bigger, so it doesn't feel so small, because this isn't a big camera by any means, but it's not a small camera by any means either. That's the main thing I'll really say about the ergonomics. The flip screen's pretty good. The viewfinder kind of gets in the way sometimes if you like using a gimbal or something. And as I said, I don't use the viewfinder very much. So speaking of video and photo modes, this can very easily switch between video, photo, and S&Q mode with this little sort of dial under the mode dial. That's one of the things that's really good about this camera, and I'm glad that they are implementing it in the newer cameras like the A7R5. Sort of along the same lines, in the camera settings, you can set photo settings and video settings, so you can have things, for example, all your custom buttons, you can set them for photo mode and you can set them for video mode. It's good that you don't have to set all your custom buttons and that's it, that's all you have, and you can't change them, because there's certain things you want to use in video that aren't useful in photo, and vice versa. All right, now when it comes to stabilization, now this obviously has in-body stabilization, so it does have mechanical sensor stabilization, so it does move the sensor, and that's really all I use. I use the standard stabilization on pretty much all the time, and I don't really use active stabilization. And the main reason that I don't use active stabilization is because it's kind of too clearly stabilized. It'll look as if the camera was like dead still, and then it just sort of jumps to there and then jumps around, it moves around. If there is sort of that sort of floating movement, or if you're trying to move smoothly, it just won't look as smooth. And maybe that's sort of an issue with me filming, but I tend to go standard stabilization pretty much all the time. And when you're trying to get a handheld look as well, again, active stabilization isn't going to give you that handheld look. So I just sort of avoid it unless it makes sense to use it. Overall, when it comes to the performance, like the image quality and everything like that, for photos, let's talk about photos really quick. The 33 megapixel sensor allows a reasonable amount of cropping as well, so you can crop in a solid amount and still have really high image quality. You can obviously also shoot in the APS-C mode, which will work out to be about a 14 megapixel photo, and I can't really complain about the image quality or anything like that. Obviously, a lot of that will depend on your lenses. All right, now switching over to video, because I do shoot mostly video. So my overall opinion on the video performance of this is pretty positive, but like I was talking about the APS-C crop before, that sort of holds it back a bit. If you are, say, going to be doing interview setups or something like this, like a long take of a YouTube video, make sure that you 100% have the flip screen open, because this camera can be prone to overheating. I've never had any issues with overheating, but it does get quite warm. Even when you're just walking around holding it, if it's just on, even the handle will get warm. So just sort of know that. So I think this camera is very good for any sort of non-high frame rate stuff. So anything you're shooting at 24, 25, 30p, it'll be great. The only issue really is rolling shutter. because it's not the best, and low lights, not the best in low light. But other than those two things, it's just pretty solid. Another plane. That's a helicopter. When it comes to the high frame rate stuff, like I said, the forced crop in 4K 60, 4K 50, and you can shoot up to 120 FPS in 1080p, which doesn't look too bad. It's just obviously 1080p, but it is still full frame. So 1080p from a 7K downsampled sensor, it's gonna be pretty good 1080p, and it also is 100 FPS or 120 FPS. Overall, for the camera as a whole, I do think it is one of the best hybrid cameras right now, and I'm glad that I got it. I got it because it was a hybrid camera, because I was shooting a lot of photos and videos, and I still do. I am now more heavily into the video side. That's why I got the FX30, but I'm glad that I got a hybrid camera first before I went straight to, you know, the video-centric cinema cameras, I guess. Technically, they call it a cinema camera. I don't know if I'd call it a cinema camera. I did in the title for that video though. So that's what I think about the Sony A7IV. Let me know if you agreed or disagreed with anything that I said, or if there's anything I missed. If you're looking for another video to watch, here is the unboxing video I did for this. Here is the video I did about how this camera goes for vlogging. And if there's space, here will be the video for my custom buttons that I have on the A7IV. Okay, bye. Oh, and do all the things too.